お時間となりましたので、始めさせていただきたいと思います。パグウォッシュ会議世界大会公開シンポジウム核抑止からの脱却を目指してを始めさせていただきます。改めまして本日司会進行を務めさせていただきます私住本明日香と申します。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。ありがとうございます。それではまず開会にあたりまして主催者であります平和創造機構広島ホープ代表広島県知事の湯崎秀彦から一言ご挨拶を申し上げます。
皆様こんにちは。ご紹介に預かりました広島県知事の湯崎でございます。本日は広島県と平和創造機構広島が主催いたしますシンポジウムに、この核抑止からの脱却を目指してにご参加いただきまして誠にありがとうございます。さて、世界には依然として1万2000発を超える核兵器が存在し、核兵器をめぐる国際情勢はこれまで以上に厳しく、核兵器が二度と使われてはならないという核のタブーが打ち破られようとする大変危機的な状況にございます。このため核兵器はその存在そのものが大きなリスクであり、その使用を防ぐ唯一かつ確実な方法は廃絶しかないということを改めて国際社会が理解し、その実現に向けて行動していくことが必要であります。県、そしてホープでは核抑止論からの脱却と核軍縮に向けた具体的な行動を促すため、核抑止論が抱えるさまざまな問題やリスクを明らかにするとともに、核兵器国や核の傘の下にある国々とも議論可能な核抑止に依存しない新たな安全保障政策を目指して研究を進めているところでございます。この度、被爆終戦80年にあたり、20年ぶりにパグウォッシュ会議世界大会を広島にお迎えすることができ、被爆から80年、今こそ平和、対話と核軍縮をテーマに、世界をリードする科学者の皆様に熱心にご議論いただいたことを大変嬉しく思っております。本日のシンポジウムには、パグウォッシュ会議から核軍縮分野、核不拡散分野で世界を牽引されてこられたお二人をお招きしております。まず、メキシコ国立自治大学物理学研究所の専任研究教授で、先般、国連の核戦争の影響に関する独立科学パネルの議長に就任されたアナ・マリア・セト・クラミス博士、次にプリンストン大学教授のフランク・フォン・ヒッペル博士のお二人でございます。本日はお二人から核抑止論を乗り越えていくためにのお話を伺うまたとない機会になると思っております。またこれに先立ちまして長崎大学核兵器廃絶研究センターの中村恵子先生から先ほどパグウォッシュ会議において発表されたばかりの広島宣言について解説をいただきます。まとめのパネルディスカッションには私も参加をさせていただきます。皆様と一緒に核抑止からの脱却について考えていきたいと考えております。核兵器は必ず廃絶しなければなりません。本日のイベントを契機といたしまして、核兵器のない平和な国際社会に向けて一層取り組みが進展することを記念いたしまして、冒頭の私からのご挨拶とさせていただきます。本日はどうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
まずは主催者であります平和創造機構広島ホープ代表広島県知事の湯崎秀彦から皆様にご挨拶でございました。それでは早速シンポジウムを開始いたします。まずはじめに本日のモデレーターを務められます中村恵子様につい先ほど閉幕いたしましたパグウォッシュ会議世界大会についてご報告いただきます。どうぞステージにお進みください。よろしくお願いいたします。 中村様ですけれども、長崎大学核兵器廃絶研究センター准教授でいらっしゃいます。核兵器問題をいかに伝えるかをテーマに、平和軍縮教育の観点から研究と実践を行っていらっしゃいます。詳しいプロフィールのご紹介はお手元にお配りしている次第にございますので、そちらをご確認ください。それでは中村様、よろしくお願いいたします。皆様、今一度大きな拍手をお送りください。
はい、ありがとうございます。皆様、こんにちは。ただいまご紹介に預かりました長崎大学核兵器廃絶研究センターレクナの中村でございます。私の方からは11月1日からもうまさに先ほど終わったばかりなんですけれども、本日まで5日間この同じ国際会議場で開催されておりましたパグオッシュ会議第63回世界大会というものにつきまして簡単に皆様にご報告をさせていただきたいと思います。なお今回のこの会議の開催にあたりまして広島県の大変なご支援をご協力ご支援いただきましたことを心より改めて感謝を申し上げる次第です。はい、ではこの会議今日のですねこのイベントがポストパグオッシュ会議ということで、パグオッシュ会議に引き続いて県とホープの主催でということでなってるんですが、そもそもこのパグオッシュ会議というこの存在とその名前そのものがですねどれくらい聞きなじみがあるのかなということを実は常に思っています。ここにいらっしゃる特に平和活動ですね、今日ご参加いただいている方の中には核兵器廃絶また平和活動に関して長らく活動されていらっしゃる方もいらっしゃると思いますし、一方では先ほどお聞きしたんですけど学生の方とかですね比較的若い世代の方も参加してくださっているというふうに聞いております。なので改めてこのパグオッシュ会議というもの何か、そしてどんな狙いでやっているのか、じゃあ5日間何やったのかということと合わせてですねちょっとご紹介をさせていただきたいと思います。まずそもそもこのパグオッシュという単語ですね、私も日頃は長崎大学で学生たちに教えているので紹介するたんびに先生これ何語ですかみたいに聞かれるんですけれども、これ実は場所の名前なんですね。カナダにあります小さな漁村でパグオッシュ村というところがございまして、まさに第1回目の先ほど第63回世界大会というふうに申し上げましたので、その第1回が開かれたその小さな漁村の名前がパグオッシュと、でそこから引き続いてずっとパグオッシュ会議という組織の名前になっていったというそういうことが実はあります。でいつかと申しますと1957年ですね、まさにこの東西冷戦のこの最中にアメリカとロシア西側東側で極めて強い、現在とはちょっと異なる形でのやはり世界が大きく分断対立をしていた時代であります。でその時にまさにその対立のですねその筆頭でありましたその米ソ中心に世界各地から著名な科学者22名がその小さなそのカナダのパグオッシュ村に集まりまして、そして核兵器の危険性であったりまた科学者の社会的責任、つまり核兵器を生み出したのは科学者であるので、一体科学者がその立場でどうやってこの問題に向き合っていくのか、何を発信していくのかということを真剣に話し合ったと、そういうことがございました。で日本からは湯川秀樹博士であったり友永慎一郎博士であったりそういった方々が参加をされたということです。でどうしてこのパグオッシュ会議がですねそもそもカナダでこれ開かれるということになったかといいますと、その2年前1955年に出されたラッセル・アインシュタイン宣言というものがございます。でそれはその前年ですね1954年ビキニでアメリカが行った水爆実験、第五福竜丸の関連で日本でも皆さんよくご存知でいらっしゃると思いますけれども、それを受けて非常に強い危機感を抱いた哲学者のバートランド・ラッセルと、それから物理学者のアルベルト・アインシュタインも言うまでもなく著名な方々ですけれども、このお二人が中心となって発した声明です。でその内容は まさに核兵器が使用されてしまえば人類は生存し続けられない、もう滅亡の道に進むんだと。そして全ての国際紛争が武力ではなく平和的な手段によって解決されなければならない、宣言はそうやって訴えたんですね。でおそらく一番有名なフレーズ、その宣言の中のフレーズというのはこれだと思います。あなたの人間性を心に留め、その他を忘れよと。私これを初めて聞いた時にやっぱり大きな衝撃というかですね、この言葉の重さというものにすごく心が震えたのを今でも覚えています。つまり世界の科学者、政治家、そしてもちろん一般市民に対して一番私たちがしなきゃいけないことは、どんな時代であろうとどんな状況であろうと人間性を忘れないこと、心に留めておくことだというふうに訴えたわけですね。でそして、今に至ります。1957年のその年の会議以降、毎年世界で科学者が集まりまして、核兵器廃絶と戦争の根絶というのを目指し、率直な意見交換を行うと。そして知識を共有すると。そしてこれからどうするかというのの具体的な道筋や提案というものを作る。これを目的とした国際会議を継続してきました。その63回目の会議がこの被爆80年、そして戦後80年の広島で開かれるという、そういったことになったわけです。で実は昨年ノーベル平和賞、日本被団協が受賞されたこと、もちろん皆様ご存知であるわけですけれども、実はパグオッシュ会議もですね、1995年にノーベル平和賞を受賞しているわけです。でさて今回の会議ですが、約40カ国からですね、科学者など、300人がここ広島に集まりました。で開会に先立っては、実は若手研究者や学生がですね、参加するスチューデント・ヤング・パグオッシュ会議というのも開かれまして、これもパグオッシュの伝統なんですね。つまり全体的に著名な科学者の方が多いので、どうしてもシニアというか年齢層高いんですけれども、しっかり次の世代にもこの精神を伝えていく、そして知識を共有する、そして一緒に考えていくということで、若い科学者、そして学生も参加をするということをしております。で5日間の会議、一部公開でしたのでご参加いただいた方もいるかもしれません。例えば公開でありました初日にはですね、その4つのノーベル平和賞受賞団体が一堂に会して、そして語り合うという、そういう非常に興味深いセッションも開かれました。4つどこだかお分かりになりますね。今もう2つ名前を出しましたけれども、もちろんその日本被団協、パグオッシュ、そして核戦争防止国際医師会議、お医者さんたちが作っている核兵器廃絶のための会議です。 IPPNW というふうに訳されます。それからこれは記憶に新しいと思います。核兵器廃絶国際キャンペーン ICAN ですね。この4つが集まりました。で全体としてはその核兵器廃絶、そして戦争の根絶というのは一貫したテーマではあるんですけれども、とりわけやはり今年はですね、その国際情勢の流れを受けてガザ、そしてウクライナ戦争について、その地域的な取り組みという、どうしてこれからどうやっていくのか、戦争をどう止めるのか、まさに今起きているこの状況にどう向き合うのかということ、それから核兵器とあと、AI などのですね、先端技術との関係と、これもまさに今年とりわけ注目されて、活発に議論されたテーマであったと思います。そしてもちろん日本を含むこの東北アジアのですね、非核の問題ということも熱心に議論が行われました。でもうすでに先ほど1957年の冷戦の最中に開始したというところにつながるわけですけれども、このパグオッシュ会議、何といってもこの肝というかですね、最大の特徴は対立を超えた対話というところにあります。つまり冷戦時代において政府同士が話すこと、米ソのですね、政府同士が話すことがやっぱり難しい。でも科学者であれば、個人であれば、しがらみを超えて、さまざまな対立を超えて、人間同士、そして科学者同士として率直に平和に向けて話ができるぞと、 そういうことであるわけです。で、今回の大会においてもですね、報道等にご覧になった方も多いと思いますけれども、パネルの一つでですね、イスラエルの元首相とパレスチナ自治政府の元外相が同じステージの上で並んで座って、これから先の中東の平和プロセスをどうやって作っていくかという、そういう話をしていくわけです。これも本当にパゴシの真骨頂といいますか、まさに政府同士ができなくても我々は一歩前に進むことができるんだと、そしてそれを市民と共にやっていくんだということを体現したというふうに思います。さて、もう終わりにしていきたいと思うんですけれども、まさにですね、皆様ご承知のように世界ではますます対立と分断が進んでいて、核使用のリスクも高まっている。そして敵対的挑発的な発言というものがさらなる反発や対立や、そして軍拡につながっていくという、まさに負のサイクルが動いていってしまってるんですね。先日のトランプ大統領の核実験再開発言なんてまさにその象徴であったかというふうに思います。ただ今回会議を通して繰り返し科学者たちが訴えていたのは、だからこそ私たちは諦めるわけにはいかないと。だからこそ私たちは対話の力を信じなければいけないと。だからこそ今のような時代だからこそさらに前に進んでいかなければいけないと。まさにそういったことが話し合われました。で、こうした具体的なですね、今の対話の重要性といったようなものに関しては、今日資料としてお配りしておりますこの広島宣言、この中にありますので、ぜひお手に取って後でじっくりでも読んでいただければと思います。で、この広島宣言の中に含まれている重要な強調点のもう一つが、まさに本日のテーマである核抑止力を超える必要性ということですね。明確にその破滅の脅威をもたらす核抑止政策では本当の平和は築けず、真の安全保障は提供しないと宣言は明確にそう述べています。そして協力と共通の安全保障、つまり誰かの犠牲の上に誰かを苦しめて自分は安全にということではなくて、みんなのための、みんなで安全な社会を、世界を作っていこうという、そういう呼びかけをしたわけです。ただおそらくですね、これを読んだ多くの方、ここにいらっしゃる皆さんも思うと思うんです。じゃあどうすればいいのかと。乗り越えるということを言うだけではなくて、じゃあ具体的に私たちがこれからどういう道を進んでいけばいいのかということを疑問に思われると思います。まさに今日ここにこのお二人の科学者、そして湯崎知事とともにそのことをこれから話していきたいというふうに思っています。その不安定な国際情勢をですね、背景に日本の中でもますます核抑止こそが私たちを守るという考えが強まっています。そうした中、私たちが声を上げることが大事だというのはもう本当にもう耳にタコができるくらい分かってるんですけれども、じゃあ具体的に何ができるのかというところをぜひ今日探っていきたいと思います。で、まさに今日いらっしゃるこのパネリストですね、この話をするのにベストな布陣となっていると思いますので、もう本当に限りの私の話を早く終わらせて中に進んでいきたくてしょうがないんですが、すいません、長々と話をしました。ぜひ皆様一緒に考えていきましょう。たくさんのご質問、会場の方、それからオンラインの方に、お願いしたいと思います。以上です。ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。大変熱い大会になったことが伝わりました。ありがとうございます。本日先ほど閉幕したばかりのパグウォッシュ会議世界大会について、中村様よりご報告をいただきました。ありがとうございます。それでは続きましてパネリストのお二人からそれぞれ発表していただきたいと思います。まずはじめにアナ・マリア・セトクラミス様から核抑止に頼ることの危険性、そして核拡散の危険性についてお話を伺いたいと思います。それではアナ・マリア・セトクラミス様、どうぞステージにお進みください。大きな拍手でお迎えください。どうぞステージへ。アナ・マリア・セトクラミス様ですが、メキシコ国立自治大学物理学研究所の専任研究教授で、国連の 核戦争の影響に関する独立科学パネルの議長を務めていらっしゃいます。なお、プロフィールのご紹介はお手元にお配りしている次第にございますので、こちらをどうぞご確認いただければと思います。マイクのフォローもありがとうございます。大丈夫そうですかね。はい。OK ですかね。はい。それでは今一度大きな拍手をお送りください。
Thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you very much for this invitation. I am honored and excited to be here with you and to be available to speak about on this important topic beyond nuclear deterrence. First, I would like to say that I saw that according to the program, I am expected to address two issues. One of them is or two topics. One of them is the UN panel on the effects of nuclear war and the dangers of relying on nuclear deterrence. And the second one is the dangers of nuclear proliferation from the experience at the International Atomic Energy Agency. But I am going to actually focus on the first topic. I'm going to give you some information on this newly established panel, the UN panel on the effects of nuclear war. But before that, I would like to say that my experience at the IAEA was as Deputy Director General for technical cooperation, which is the good side of the IAEA. So nothing to do with the nuclear proliferation, but on the contrary, what nuclear science and technologies can do for good, for the benefit of humanity. And that was a very positive experience, I must say, very rewarding to work with all member states to promote the peaceful uses of nuclear technologies. And for those who don't know it, but the International Atomic Energy Agency is a body that is associated to the United Nations. It's a multilateral body, governmental, no? And it was founded precisely on the same year as Pugwash, that is in 1957, and that was not by chance. No? So, firstly, before addressing the topic of the UN panel of the effects of nuclear war, I would like to begin by thanking His Excellency Hidehiko Yuzaki, the distinguished governor of Hiroshima and friend of Mexico, I know, because I come from Mexico. I should have said that at the beginning. And for inviting me to be a panelist at this event organized in the immediate aftermath of the annual Pugwash Conference. It is a special honor and a pleasure to be joined by Professor von Himpel on this memorable occasion. And it is memorable for me for two reasons, because one of them is that exactly 30 years ago, I came here because we had our annual Pugwash conference in 1995 here, still with Sir Joseph Rotblat as president of Pugwash. And that was a memorable occasion also. It was exactly the year when we received the Nobel Peace Prize. And well, finally, also the Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to the organization and to the survivors of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And also the International Atomic Energy Agency received the Nobel Peace Prize, and that was in 2005, just 20 years ago. So we are brothers in this of the Nobel Peace Prize. So Well, as you may be aware, I don't know if you are. Well, I must say before I start with the topic of the UN panel that this Pugwash conference that just ended today was really a very important occasion for many of us. For me, it was coming back to Pugwash after many years, and I saw that this organization is very vibrant today, and we had some very good discussions, some excellent presentations, some very informative, others very, very moving. So, what is important, as has just been said, is that we go beyond rhetoric and we really find ways of moving forward and making concrete steps towards peace, disarmament, and beyond nuclear deterrence. Well, now, yes, as you may be aware or maybe not, an independent scientific panel on the effects of nuclear war has been established pursuant to General Assembly, UN General Assembly resolution, the resolution 79/238 of 2025, less than a year ago. And one has to remember that the last so-called study on the climatic and other global effects of nuclear war, or better known as the Nuclear Winter Report, had been mandated by the General Assembly in the 1980s and was published a long time ago, in 1989. So that was the last report on the effects of nuclear explosions. And much has happened in the meantime. The world is much more weaponized today. There are more tensions. The world has become more complex also. Our planet has become less resilient. So the United Nations General Assembly, that means all the member states of the United Nations, decided and agreed that it was time to finally produce an updated report, and that should be a scientific report, independent and also based on evidence, which is not easy because there has not been a nuclear war, and we don't want any nuclear war to break. So it is a difficult job for the panel to make this study as reliable as possible, but that is the purpose. Well, over the last 40 years, in fact, the power and the destructive capacity of nuclear weapons has increased substantially, as we all know. We saw some figures this morning, and I'm sure that my colleague Frank von Hippel will tell you much more about that, and with insight, deep knowledge about it. Unfortunately, this landscape has been accompanied also by state-of-the-art non-nuclear technological development, including what are called disruptive technologies. So that is making our world a far more dangerous place. And it is precisely against this backdrop that the UN resolution was adopted in 2025. And it is part, by the way, it is part of the so-called Pact of the Future that was adopted by the UN General Assembly. The resolution, this resolution on the UN panel, recalls that, and I will quote, removing the threat of nuclear war is the most acute and urgent task of the present day. And it calls the resolution for, and I will quote again, an updated, comprehensive scientific assessment of the effects of nuclear war and its consequences, determining where there is agreement among the scientific community and where more research is needed. Well, in accordance with this mandate, the UN Secretary General appointed 21 members, which are the members of the panel, to serve in their personal capacities, individuals, after selecting them from a large number of nominations received from member states and from a broad public call for candidates. We are fortunate to have also a distinguished member from Japan in the panel, who brings his knowledge and his wisdom and is a guide for, and a beacon in the panel. Members were selected for their leading scientific expertise across relevant disciplines, while also ensuring impartiality and equitable geographical and gender representation, and having regard for the recommendations of the relevant United Nations agencies, like, well, there are several, like the IAEA, the UNESCO, the World Health Organization, etc. The panel is mandated to examine, according to the recommendation, the physical effects and societal consequences of a nuclear war on a local, on a regional, and on a planetary scale. It is also empowered to review and commission relevant studies with the aim of publishing a comprehensive report. Our final report will be considered by the UN General Assembly in 2027, which means 2 years from now. It may seem a long time, but it is not it is not a long time. It's quite short if we want to produce a really serious, reliable, and comprehensive report. We already had a first plenary meeting exactly 2 months ago, at the beginning of September in New York. Most of the panel members could be present, fortunately. Others had to participate online. And on that occasion, well, we got to know each other, although some of us already knew each other, of course. And the panel appointed me as a chair, as well as a vice chair, who is Sir Andrew Haynes from the UK. And he's a medical doctor. And we decided to divide our work into 3 groups, which are meeting already regularly, on a very regular basis, every 3 weeks or so, each one of the working groups, in addition to working intensely between meetings. And I'm witness of that, because the panel members are really very committed and are doing their work. And when they come together in their meetings, they have really made progress and have a clear idea already what they want to include in the report, and they have a structure already for each one of the working groups, etc. So I will describe briefly what every working group is supposed to focus on. The first working group focuses on the immediate effects, the physical effects of nuclear explosions, either one explosion or multiple explosions, including, for instance, blast effects, the climate, the radiation, the fires. The fires are, as you know, very important. Working group 2, the second working group, focuses on the direct impacts on populations, on the ecosystems, on agriculture, on animal health, and the working group 3 focuses on the cascading effects, the economic effects, financial, societal, governance impacts, including of course, the effects on interdependent critical infrastructure systems, like the systems used for transportation, communications, etc. Each one of the working groups has working groups, the first one and the second one have two co-facilitators, and the third one has one facilitator. And one of our panel members has been appointed as the scientific secretary, and he's doing an excellent job in ensuring consistent approaches across groups and identifying any gaps in the scope of the panel's work. Our aim, the panel's aim, is to analyze and synthesize the growing body of scientific knowledge on the effects of nuclear explosions. We say of nuclear war, but actually, since there has not been a nuclear war, we have to look at the effects of all nuclear explosions that have already occurred. And there have been, in addition to the explosions here, there has been, as we heard this morning, 2,000 nuclear tests, no? and other explosions that we have to take into account, in particular the nuclear accidents. So that's what we have for evidence, no? And we have to look very seriously at the evidence that is there, that is reliable, that is very important, no? But we have to do that within the context of the current scientific and technological developments. In line with our mandate, we will determine where there is agreement among the scientific community on the impacts and the effects and the cascading effects, no? And we will determine where there is this agreement, but also which areas require further research that is not there, but we think is important to do in order to have a more complete picture. We will draw our conclusions from a critical and rigorous assessment of the evidence, not of what is said, that sometimes we tend to let's say, to describe, to express our fears or our partial knowledge, and but if we want to make a reliable report to the UN and to the public at large, we have to be very careful with basing our conclusions and the whole report on scientific evidence. Well, of course, as I said, this evidence is incomplete and it is limited, but that is why perhaps further studies are needed, and that will be part of the report, our recommendation in this regard. This panel includes physicists, for instance, physicists who specialize in nuclear risk assessment, atmospheric scientists, environmental and geochemists, medical doctors who focus on radiation epidemiology, as well as climate change and health, and specialists in complex socioeconomic systems. Other panelists specialize in agricultural, animal, and veterinary sciences, and in data modeling. Much modeling has been carried out, which will also provide valuable input. However, it is clear that we cannot undertake this work without the assistance of outside expertise. We do not cover the whole landscape, let's say. Our mandate calls upon us to review and commission relevant studies and to consult with a broad range of scientists and experts, as well as the widest possible range of stakeholders also, including civil society, affected communities, and peoples from around the world and other parts of the UN system and relevant agencies, such as those I mentioned earlier. The identification of experts with whom the panel will hold a first round of consultations in in hybrid format during the first week of December is already underway. We have a very interesting list of external experts. Additionally, an open call will be issued by the United Nations Secretariat, specifically the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs, which is the part of the Secretariat that is supporting this work. This call probably will not be for the first round of consultations, but for the second one, which will take place in March next year. It is very important also to listen to the public at large, to the stakeholders, because the affected communities have always some inside information and some a different approach to the issue that we need to not only listen to, but also take into account as much as possible in our deliberations. So, distinguished colleagues, ladies, gentlemen, I can barely see you because of the light, but I very much appreciate that you are here, and I would like to say a few personal to share with you some personal reflections on the title of the session today. I am personally convinced that the world must move away from the nuclear deterrence doctrine inherited from the previous Cold War era. This perverse notion has not only been shown to be of no benefit to humanity, it has also driven us down a more dangerous path. In fact, yesterday, in a very brief opportunity I had to speak to the Puguash audience, I said we have to change our perspective and look at the issues from the peaceful side, move away definitely from this old Cold War approach that is still dominating much of the discussion and much of the international environment. In some places, much more than others. I come from a nuclear weapon-free zone where we don't have this problem, and we have a different approach, always from the side of the peace, not from the side of the war. We don't speak of deterrence. In fact, I come from a Latin American country, and you know, in Spanish, we don't have the word deterrence with a negative message. We have a word that is translated, the translation is disuasión, which has a positive message. And today, in our almost final session, we listened with much respect and with much, let's say, it was very moving. We listened to a colleague of Palestinian origin, and he said he is a victim, a witness of what has happened in Palestine, and he doesn't live there anymore. And he also said, we need to change courses. We must replace the vocabulary of war with the grammar of justice, he said, freedom, dignity, equality, rights, and I added another word which we often not only use, but we practice in our region, which is solidarity. So I think personally that this is very urgent, that we shift, we move away from this mindset, and we look at the issues from the other side, from building peace and from the peace side, not from escalating wars, which unfortunately is happening today and still dominates the landscape. Therefore, in addition to producing a serious study and presenting the final report to the UN General Assembly, I consider it of the utmost importance to inform the general public of the outcome, including decision makers and younger generations, to make them fully aware of the risks posed by nuclear weapons and work actively for their elimination. You here are fully aware, but you can't imagine what happens in other places of the world. The younger generations are not aware of the situation that you have lived through, not of the current situation today of how the world has become more weaponized and more dangerous. So one important finality and purpose of this UN report will be precisely to make it accessible and readable and understandable to the rest of the world and to all generations. The future, because the future depends on all of us, and we all have a part to play in averting danger and in securing a livable world. Thank you very much.
アナマリア・セトクラミス様、ありがとうございました。今一度大きな拍手をお送りください。ありがとうございます。核抑止に頼ることの危険性、そして核拡散の危険性についてお話をいただきました。フランク・フォン・ヒッペル様から核抑止に頼らない安全保障に移行するにはについてお話を伺いたいと思います。フランク・フォン・ヒッペル様はプリンストン大学科学グローバルセキュリティプログラム上級研究物理学者および公共国際問題学名誉教授でいらっしゃいます。またこちらですね、私が今手元にございますけれども、今年の初めに先生の回想録が出版されました。現在翻訳中ということです。さて、なおプロフィールのご紹介はお手元にお配りしている次第にございますのでご確認ください。それではフランク・フォン・ヒッペル様に今一度大きな拍手をお送りください。
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about two things, and briefly. One has to do with whether nuclear weapons, whether we can make an agreement that nuclear weapons should not be used first. If nobody uses nuclear weapons first, then nobody will use nuclear weapons second, and then. But it turns out it's a very controversial issue, and I'd like to explain that to you. And I think some of you may have heard that President Trump wants to resume nuclear testing. And well, maybe I'll just say something about that first briefly. We have basically stopped nuclear tests. Between 1945 and 1995, there were about 2,000 nuclear tests, about 40 a year. And then in 1996, there was a treaty negotiated to end nuclear testing. And since that time, since 1998, only one country has tested about 7 times, and that's North Korea. A few days ago, President Trump said that since other countries have been testing, the U.S. should test too. It's very confusing because other countries have not been testing, and then he ordered we used to call the Defense Department, which now President Trump insists on calling the War Department, its old name before the end of World War II. he ordered them to start testing. But in fact, U.S. nuclear warheads are not tested by the War Department. They're tested by the Energy Department, which has within it an agency called the National Nuclear Security Administration. And the head of the Energy Department said, we're not going to test. So so then there's a total confusion, I guess we don't know how things are going to turn out, but it would be a tremendous blow to the effort to control nuclear weapons if, in fact, the U.S. began testing again. And so, and we'll do our best to prevent that from happening. I'm sorry, my computer went to sleep. Have to wake it up again. Whoops. I have a very long password. Whoops. It doesn't. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Yours doesn't go to sleep. Okay. Okay, so let's skip the next slide, and I'll go to the issue with regard to the question of no first use. In January 2022, the first 5 nuclear weapon states repeated a statement that had been made during the Cold War by Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev, saying that a nuclear war cannot be won, and must never be fought. That's good. But then they continued. The statement continued, and they said, for as long as they continue to exist, nuclear weapons should deter aggression and prevent war. Now, I'm sorry? Okay. If you want to deter a nuclear attack, then you can threaten to use nuclear weapons in response to a nuclear attack between 2 nuclear-armed countries. But if you want to deter nuclear war more generally, for example, a war with conventional weapons, then you have to threaten to use nuclear weapons first in response to another kind of attack. And that would turn a conventional war into a nuclear war, and the end could be the end of civilization. As I will explain that, in fact, the U.S. does make threats to use nuclear wars first in case of attacks on the U.S. or on 32 allies that are including Japan, which are under its so-called nuclear umbrella. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the situation with regard to the nuclear weapons in the world. The countries, the 7 countries there on the world map that are colored red have nuclear weapons, or the 9 countries actually. The green countries are countries that have declared themselves parts of nuclear weapons-free zones. So mostly in the southern hemisphere. Now the countries that I want to focus on are the yellow countries. Except for one, those yellow countries are countries to which the U.S. has made a commitment that if they don't acquire nuclear weapons, the U.S., and they need nuclear weapons in their defense, then the U.S. will use nuclear weapons in their defense. And that includes Japan. And it turns out that Japan is a central part in the debate. So, next slide. This is the history of the number of nuclear weapons in the world. You see that it's gone up at the peak of the Cold War to 60,000, and it's down now to about 10,000. And you also see that the U.S. in blue and the Soviet Union and then Russia in orange dominate. The other 7 countries, all their warheads are that very thin slice at the bottom of the and they amount to in total maybe less than 1,000 warheads. So next slide. So this is another way to see the situation today. The U.S. and Russia have many more nuclear warheads, about 4,000 each, than the other countries, which have about a few hundred each. So why do they have so many warheads? Well, it's really because their warheads were mostly, and still are mostly, aimed at each other. It's like a version of the World War I artillery duels, where the two sides would shoot guns at each other's guns. So this means, but if you want to destroy the other country's nuclear weapons, you have to go first. It's certainly you will destroy very many more if you go first. And so this is the main subject of my talk: is if we get an agreement, can get an agreement on no first use of nuclear weapons, then the world will be much safer from nuclear war. But that means that the umbrella that the U.S. offers to its allies, that it will use its nuclear weapons if they're attacked, including attacks without nuclear weapons, that umbrella would go away. And the countries, Japan and other countries, have become quite feel that makes them safer, makes them feel safer. So we have a conflict between the feelings by allies of the U.S. that want to be able to have a threat of U.S. nuclear weapons against countries that might attack them, and the danger of a nuclear war which could threaten the whole world. Next slide. Now, it's even more complicated than I just described, because as nuclear missiles have become more accurate, especially, this shows a picture of a U.S. missile. It's an intercontinental ballistic missile, and you see that it's buried in the ground. It's a so-called silo of reinforced concrete, very heavy concrete cover, and when these installations were first made, the Soviet Union's missiles were not accurate enough to destroy such a hard target. But they have become more accurate, and the U.S. Missiles similarly have become more accurate, and they now do threaten. And so that there's a concern about a first use, a first strike. And on the right, you see a map, and those red areas Each of those red areas contains 150 of these installations. And so you know, so that these, the situation is then that if a Russian missile is launched, or many Russian missiles are launched to attack the U.S. missiles, then the U.S. has decided to launch on warning. Before the Russian warheads would arrive, the U.S. would launch on warning. Well, the time of flight of a missile from Russia to the United States is about 30 minutes. And so that would mean that the president would have about 10 minutes to decide what to do. And there have been false warnings. This situation is a very dangerous situation. And the solution that I and many other people have proposed is, let's just get rid of these missiles. They put us in a greater danger than they offer protection. But we have not yet succeeded in that. Next slide. Now, the U.S. has many other nuclear weapons, and most of them are actually in submarines, in the oceans, and they're very quiet submarines, and we're quite confident that nobody can find them and target them. So these weapon systems are not under pressure to launch. If in fact there were an attack on the U.S. or one of its allies, or on the U.S. In this case, there would be, you could wait for weeks if you wanted to figure out what happened and to think about what to do about it. And it's interesting that the United Kingdom and France, all they have is these missiles on the submarines. You can see in this case there are about 16 missiles in this submarine, and in the case of the UK, they feel comfortable that one of these submarines in the ocean, hidden in the ocean, will discourage any other country from attacking the United Kingdom. Well, the U.S. has at any one time 8 or 10 of these submarines in the ocean. So that's why we would like to get rid of. Of course, we'd like to get rid of all the nuclear weapons, but for a first step, we would like to get rid of these dangerous intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are in this launch on warning posture. Now, now I'd like to turn just briefly to the no first use policies. If the U.S. and Russia, and China already has a no first use policy. If the U.S. and Russia had no first use policies, that would be another big step toward nuclear disarmament, because if nobody's going to use nuclear weapons first, then nobody's, in principle, nobody's going to use nuclear weapons, and we should get rid of them. Okay, I've actually talked about this slide already, so I'll go to the next one. But in fact, and this is why I'm giving this talk here, and I gave a talk in the Pugwash conference on this subject. some countries or under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, and especially Japan, oppose a U.S. no first use policy. And whenever we have a debate nationally about this, both Presidents Obama and President Biden wanted to have a U.S. no first use policy. There was a pushback, first from the Department of Defense and from some fraction of the members of Congress, saying we should not remove any option from the table. But then they also say, and furthermore, some of the countries under the U.S. nuclear umbrella would become very nervous about this, and in fact might even get their own nuclear weapons if we adopt a no first use policy. And in fact, here we've had Japanese government officials say as much, that they oppose a U.S. no first use policy. They have, and when Presidents Obama at least proposed that the U.S. should adopt a no first use policy, Japan's government sent diplomats to try to explain to the U.S. Government why that would be a bad idea. So this is the formulation of the Japanese government's position, most recently, public formulation, from 2021, when the Chief Cabinet Secretary Kato explained why Japan's government objects to a U.S. no first use policy. He said, first of all, all nuclear weapon states should have simultaneously adopt a no first use policy, and furthermore, that it should be verifiable that they have a no first use policy. But then he said that there was no way to verify a no first use policy because, of course, the country could change its mind. And in any case, he said, Japan feels the need to have to be able to threaten the first use of nuclear weapons in case, say, China or Russia attacks Japan's with conventional weapons, because they have very powerful militaries, and so as long as such security threats to Japan exist, he said, I believe that the U.S. nuclear deterrence is indispensable. Or really, he meant U.S. First willingness to use nuclear weapons first. So I wanted to make you aware of your government's insistence on a U.S. first nuclear use option, and because Hiroshima has such an active engagement with this issue, perhaps you can try to educate your government. If you agree with my argument, educate your government that maybe the danger would be reduced of nuclear war would be reduced if the U.S. had a no first use policy. Last slide, I think. Now, there would still be some deterrent value even if the U.S. had a no first use policy, because the U.S. and Japan could change their minds, and they would have and as long as the U.S. has nuclear weapons, there would be some deterrent value. I mean, it's like in the United States, policemen have guns. I don't know whether they do in Japan, but it makes you think twice about punching a policeman in the nose, even though you know they shouldn't use their guns in response. You never know. And I would like to note also that I think actually both Presidents Obama and Biden had, you know, the president is the decision maker on this question of nuclear weapons use in the U.S. And so President Obama and Biden could, even if they don't publicly say they have adopted a no first use policy, they could make the decision they could think about it in advance and make that decision. That would not, I would like to go further and bind all presidents, have Congress bind all presidents to a U.S. policy of no first use. I believe that President Biden decided, you know that Russia made nuclear threats threats of nuclear first use in case NATO supported Ukraine beyond a certain point that Russia could tolerate. And I think that forced President Biden to think through what he would do if Russia used one or a small number of nuclear weapons in the Ukraine war. And I am convinced that, in fact, he had decided on a non-nuclear response to a Russian first use of nuclear weapons, because he saw if the U.S. responded with nuclear weapons, then it would start a sequence, and in the end, civilization would be destroyed. And he had an option, an alternative. Of course, Russia's use of nuclear weapons should not be unpunished. But I think his alternative was that if Russia used nuclear weapons first, U.S. conventional forces, and especially the aircraft, would destroy Russia's military forces in Ukraine. That was the response. And, that because it would be less dangerous. So so I've talked about two things. I've tried to explain to you the no first use issue, and I've also just briefly talked about this question of whether the U.S., the current debate in the U.S. about whether, initiated by President Trump with his fantasy that other countries are testing, the debate now that is going on and will be going on in the United States about that issue. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。フランク・フォン・ヒッペル様より核抑止に頼らない安全保障に移行するにはについてお話を伺いました。今一度大きな拍手をお送りください。ありがとうございました。それではここで次のパネルディスカッションの準備をさせていただきますので、皆様そのまま今しばらくお待ちください。ステージが整いましたので、これよりご紹介させていただきたいと思います。それではですね、湯崎知事、アナマリア・セドクラミス様、フランク・フォン・ヒッペル様、そして中村様、どうぞステージにお進みください。皆様拍手でお迎えください。よろしくお願いいたします。
お待たせいたしました。ではここからですね、最初にお三方と少しお話をさせていただいて、その後ちょっと限られた時間になってしまいますが、やはり対話が大事だと冒頭申しましたので、ぜひ会場およびオンラインのご参加の皆様からのご質問を取りたいと思っています。で、オンラインの方ですね、Q&A ボックスの方に、いつでもご記入いただけますので、その旨ご承知ください。さて、ではまずですね、湯崎知事にお伺いしたいと思います。お二人、具体的な現在の動きやまたご提案というものがあっ ったわけですけれども、受け止めをですねお話しいただきたいと思います。合わせて広島で核抑止力を乗り越えていくアプローチについてももう少し具体的なところを教えていただければと思いますのでお願いいたします。
はい、まず広島県での取り組み、すごく簡単に言いますと、3つのアプローチというのをやっていまして、で1つは人道性アプローチ、これはいかに核兵器が非人道的かっていうことを広島や長崎に来ていただいて皆さんに理解していただくということで、2つ目が安全保障アプローチで、これは核抑止に代わる新しい安全保障の在り方というのを世界に示していこうということですね。で3つ目が持続可能性アプローチということで、核兵器を使う、核兵器は持続可能な人類社会に対する、大きな脅威であるということで、これを国連の開発目標ですね、 SDGs2030 年に終わりますので、その次の国連の目標に核兵器廃絶を入れていこうと、これは持続可能性の問題として核兵器廃絶を入れていこうというのが我々のアプローチなんですが、今の3つのアプローチにそれぞれやはりお二人の今日お話しいただいたことで非常に関連してまして、例えばこの、科学パネルの成果というのはですね、今のその持続可能性ということの議論の強化をしていくということですし、それから安全保障アプローチにおいてはですね、このいかにファーストユースであるとか、リスクリダクションから核軍縮ですね、この核軍縮を進めていくかというところに大きく関わっています。そしてもちろん非人道性ということもですね、この科学パネルに関わってくる話ですし、その安全保障についても実はこの科学パネルの結果っていうのも関わってくるんですね。というのも核兵器廃絶を考えていくときにこの3つの側面があると思うんですね。一つはその核抑止がいかに大きな問題を抱えているかっていうことを示していくっていうことで、これのその一つの側面っていうのが核兵器が使われた場合にですね、いかに悲惨な結果を生み出すかっていうこと、これは核兵器すみません、科学パネルのまさに成果にもつながって、成果からもまた導き出されることだと思います。そしてもう一つの側面はこの核兵器のリスクを減らしていくということですね。あるいは今世界で言われているステップバイステップと言われることですけれども、例えば今のこのノーファーストユースっていうのは非常に重要なステップですね。その前には例えば CTBT 核実験放火性核実験禁止条約、これで核実験を完全に禁止しましょう。でこれはまだ発行してないんですね。これを発行させるということが重要ですし、あるいは FMCT ですね、この核物質禁止製造禁止条約かな、日本語はちょっと分かりませんけど、これによって核兵器の元になるこの物質ですね、これを作らないようにしようという、そしてまたノーファーストユースというのがあると、こういうステップを踏んでリスクを減らしていく、これが2つ目のこの側面で、3つ目の側面は、じゃあその最後のですね、じゃあノーファーストユースあるいはその核兵器の役割というのを減らしていくっていうのを進んでいった時に、じゃあ本当にどうやったらなくせるのかっていうところですね。ヒッペル博士の今日お話の中で出てこなかったんですけども、最後検証するっていうのがあったんですけども、これは意思決定をして核兵器がなくなった場合には検証するということが非常に重要になってくるんですが、そのなくすという意思決定をするためには核兵器のない安全保障の在り方っていうのがどうしても必要になってきて、それが3つ目の側面ですね。核兵器の役割をどんどんなくしていくと、だけれどもそれを本当になくすためには核兵器のない、安全保障の在り方ということが、この核兵器国の皆さんが納得をしないといけないということで、それは今 ホープではですね、詳細に研究をしていこうという取り組みをしているところです。
はい、ありがとうございます。ではチェト先生、それからフォン・ヒッペル先生にもですね、他の方のご発言を聞いての受け止めなどを自由に発言していただきたいと思います。ただ私からですね、もし先に一つ質問させていただくとしたら、やはり本日科学的ないわゆるエビデンスベースのですね議論の重要性というところがやはり一つのポイントだと思うんですけれども、それをどうやってその政策決定者、政治家等を含めてですね、社会に広く認識させていくのか、そのためには何が必要かというところをもう少し知りたいと思います。例えばチェト先生お話になった国連の科学パネルにはですね、おそらく市民社会からもたくさんインプットができるものであると思うんですよね。でもはっきり言ってあまりニュースにはなってるけどあまり知られていないと、筋道が見えない。それからフォン・ヒッペル博士のお話しされた宣戦布使用の話ですね。まさに日本政府自体がそのアメリカが宣戦布使用宣言するということに、いわゆるこのブレーキをかけているというかストップをかけていると、そういう状況にあるというお話だったわけですね。これ実に日本の多くの方に考えていただきたい問題ではあるのですが、ただ今日皆様お聞きになったの宣戦布使用という言葉自体がどうしても概念的に難しいこともあって、なかなか広く議論が進んでいかないというところもあるんじゃないかなと思うんですね。そのあたりどうやって広めていくのか、科学者と市民の対話をしていくのかってところもちょっとお聞きしたいと思っています。お二人どちらかでも構いませんので、あればぜひお願いします。Would you like to speak first or just a brief comment from each one?
Thank you very much for this question, and thank you also for your intervention, His Excellency, because you raised an important point. First, I will try to respond to your question, but then I would like also to make a comment on His Excellency's intervention. You asked about how we're going to disseminate, how the report is going to be disseminated. Actually, we envisage the participation of civil society in two stages. First, during the preparation of the report, as I said, it is very important to also listen to this, to all stakeholders, and we all are stakeholders. No? There will be several hearings. The first one will be in early December, but we are going to listen to experts who can help us precise the focus and define the issue areas. Huh? But in March, we do expect to have also experts, not necessarily experts who know the detailed evidence that is already published, but who can also give us their experiences and their perceptions in order that we don't miss any important aspect in our study. And there are civil organizations and non-governmental organizations that have been very much engaged in these issues. Several have been mentioned here. And then there are others. For instance, I'm thinking of the International Council for Science, what was called the Third World Academy of Science, no? Which is now the Academy of Sciences of the world, they say. So these are organizations that also have scientists, not necessarily nuclear experts, but who have a broader view and understanding of current status of the world in terms of, for instance, climate change issues, and the loss of resilience, the more complex system issues that perhaps we are not taking into account because the evidence is basically evidence from the past, where the world was not so as complex as it is today. No? And then there will be the second phase of engagement with the civil society, with the public at large, which will be when the report is issued. The report will be presented to the UN General Assembly in 2027, but it is extremely important that it is better known by the public at large, because otherwise it may be simply, well, put into a drawer, no? If member states so decide, if the population and the non-governmental organizations don't push for its serious consideration of the findings that will be presented in the report. And as you were asking this question, I was thinking that maybe we could still play a role as ambassadors, no? And let's say help communicate the findings and disseminate the report and elicit an engagement, especially from the younger generations that are not aware. No? Now, I take the opportunity of having the microphone in my hands to ask you, His Excellency, what if you have already a clear picture of this alternative security concept. That is something that I am particularly interested, because, you know, in our language, we don't distinguish between safety and security. We have one word which is mainly, it is related to safety rather than security. And we always have problems when we hear the term security, which is not part of our, let's say, conceptual thinking. No? We prefer to think in terms of safety than security. So, but you mentioned on several times that you are thinking of an alternative security. What would that be if it is non-nuclear?
安全保障、これまた日本語で言うとややこしいですけども、国家安全保障ですね。国家安全保障のこと、セキュリティっていうのは国家安全保障のことを指してますけども、安全、いわゆるセーフティーっていうと、例えば何でしょう、健康に対する安全だとかですね、心理的な安全だとか、そういうことを指すことが多いと思いますけど、我々はこの場合は国家安全保障、国が国として存在をし続けるための必要なことっていうかですね、そういうことを指しています。
じゃあ。
My question was, what is the alternative you have in mind if it is non-nuclear? Yes.
今まさに抑止力の問題ですね。戦争を、ないしは相手国というか敵対国の、アグレッション、を防ぐために今核兵器に依存しているということになってますけれども、これは核兵器国あるいは核の傘の下にある国の場合ですけども、そこに核抑止という概念があるわけですね。で、その核抑止に代わる抑止、どうやったら相手国の敵対的な行動を抑止できるかっていう新しい考え方です。でこれはなぜ核抑止に今依存しているかっていうと、単純には その通常兵器では抑止できないっていうふうに、思っているということだと思うんですね。今多くの軍事専門家は通常兵器では抑止ができないというふうに思っているというふうに考えられていると思うので、じゃあその通常兵器も含めて本当に抑止っていうことができるのか、あるいはそのもっと概念を広げて、その戦争なりその、敵対国の侵攻を防ぐための、フレームワークっていうのはどういうものがあるのかということを考えていきましょうという、そういうことを今考えていることで、じゃあ具体的にそれがどういうことで実現できるかっていうのはですね、これはまさに今研究途上であって、もっともっとですね、我々としては多くの研究者に参加をしていただいて考えてほしいな。これは本当にいろんな側面があります。いろんな要素がありますので、それを多くの研究者で考えていきたいなと思っているところです。
ありがとうございます。皆様お気づきのようにちょっとですね、もうすでに予定の時間を過ぎてしまっていますが、もう少しせっかく大事な議論に入ってきているので、もし皆様お許しいただければ少しだけですね10分ぐらいの延長で、はい、ありがとうございます。そうしましたらですね、フォン・ヒッペル博士に私の質問に答えていただく必要は必ずしもありません。もし別のテーマを挙げていただいても構いませんが、他の方へのコメントなり何か問いかけなりあればまずお願いいたします。
I'd like to go back to the issue of no first use. And I have a personal story here. My grandfather was in the U.S. World War II nuclear weapons program. And the reason was because of out of fear that Germany was developing nuclear weapons. After Germany was defeated, and while the war with Japan was still continuing, he organized a group of the scientists in the nuclear weapons project to go to Washington, to send a message to Washington to argue that the nuclear weapon should not be used against Japan. That was first use. And the argument was first that Japan was already defeated, but even more importantly in their view was that if the U.S. unilaterally decided to use a nuclear weapon without consulting the Soviet Union, it would start a nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union, which of course it did. So we're here with the first use happened.
ありがとうございます。では会場の皆様からのご質問に移りたいと思います。まずどれくらいの方がご質問あられるかということで、挙手を最初にお願いしてもよろしいでしょうか。はい、今お三人の方から手が挙がっておりますので、一旦そこでちょっと締め切らせていただきます。ではマイクを回していただけるようですか。そうしましたらですね、まず手前のお二人の、では向かって今ご本か何か手帳を持っていらっしゃる方、はい、もし差し支えなければお名前もお願いできればと思います。
興味深いご発表ありがとうございました。私は広島市立大学国際学部中国からの留学生陳信と申します。私今は核抑止の正当性と見解、冷戦からロシア・ウクライナ戦争までというテーマについて研究しています。その点について多くの研究者が核抑止は本当に平和を一致することができますという意見がありますので、私は核抑止は本当に平和を一致するための仕組みなのか、それとも逆に戦争を長期化さらに長くさせる要因なのかという疑問が持っています。よろしくお願いします。
はい、ありがとうございます。では質問を最初にお三方から聞いて、その後にまとめて答えていただく形にいたします。では手前の方お願いいたします。よければお名前から。
貴重なお話をありがとうございました。ノートルダム精神高等学校2年の南條さゆねと申します。私は今学校で平和 活動をする部活に入っていて、現在来年の学園祭に向けて平和とは何か、核兵器廃絶のために何が大切なのか、そして核兵器をなくすだけで平和は達成できるのか、そしてもう一つ、核兵器を作る技術が残って、核兵器を廃絶しても核兵器をなくす技術が残っていれば、原子力とかウランの採掘がある中でもう一度核兵器を作ってしまうのではないか、そしてグローバル被爆者についてはどうなるのかっていう点について、ポスターという形でまとめようと思っています。その点で私たちも今たくさん調べ学習をしているのですが、なかなか難航しているので、もしこういうことを書いたらいいよとか、こういうのを若者にどんどん発信してもらいたいっていうのがあったら、ぜひ教えていただきたいなというふうに思います。よろしくお願いします。
はい、ありがとうございます。では後ろの方、お名前からお願いいたします。
Thank you very much. Toshio Umera from Hiroshima Peace Institute of Hiroshima City University. My question would be probably towards Dr. Kramis, but other panelists can also comment. It is about the outreach and the need for the engagement with civil society. And well, I mean, yeah, I really wish you luck for, you and us, disarmament community, have good luck for fact-based knowledge and dialogue. But meanwhile, in social media and SNS, I mean, it's full of false, toxic messages, and especially regarding nuclear weapon. For example, in Japan, there's a sort of noisy minority, I believe, but noisy voices that nuclear weapons are cheaper, which I totally disagree. But how do you think of engaging those type of discourses, especially in social media sphere? For example, does the panel have a Instagram account? Something like that. Thank you.
はい、ありがとうございます。では今のお三方のご質問を受けまして、それぞれ皆様にすみません、時間の関係でできれば2分ぐらいで全てお答えする必要あります。皆様で必要だと思うところのお答えをいただければと思います。では順番としては反対からいきましょうか。ではフォンヒッペル博士からお願いいたします。
Well, I'll take the two questions. One, could we have a nuclear weapon-free world? If I understood that was the question, because couldn't people make nuclear weapons again? And I think that's right. We would have to have a very different world. It's been discussed to some extent. We would have to have an open world that you couldn't have such secrets. And one way to do that would be to have a law in every country that if people detected any activity relating to making nuclear weapons, then they would report that to an international agency. Maybe today it might be the International Atomic Energy Agency, but it is a real that world doesn't exist today. And so that would be part of the negotiations to go to zero. The other question relates to whether nuclear weapons are cheaper and in fact, early in the Cold War, the U.S. demobilized, especially in Europe. We reduced the sizes of our army tremendously, and the Soviet Union didn't. So all of a sudden, we had the situation where the Western Europe felt very threatened by these huge Soviet armies, which were in Eastern Europe, and President Eisenhower didn't want to spend all that money to make to build all the tanks and so on to equal the Soviet Union. And so the argument was made, it's cheaper to have nuclear weapons. And in fact, at one point the U.S. had about 10,000 nuclear weapons in Europe and to destroy the Soviet tanks. So, but of course it would have destroyed Europe at the same time. So it was crazy, but that was the argument that was made. And so in one sense, they are cheaper, but in the other sense, if they were used, they would be much more costly.
じゃあ次はチェト先生お願いします。
Yes. Is it? Yes. Yes, I will try to be very concise. The first, your question was about whether the absence of nuclear weapons would guarantee peace. Not at all. In fact, there are some armed conflicts today, killing hundreds or even thousands of people in several parts of the world without nuclear weapons. No. So peace is a much broader concept, and as some of you know, because I hear even that we have here an expert in peace studies, no? We need much more than that. We need justice, we need equity, we need many other aspects to a more livable world to be really in peace. But today we have focused on the issue of nuclear weapons, but there are other kinds of weapons. There are many tensions around the world, and so it's very important to go deeper into the causes of these conflicts, and that will also help hopefully to get rid of all kinds of weapons, including nuclear weapons. But now about the outreach. So far in the panel, we have not discussed in depth how we are going to do this in dissemination and to do outreach activities, because we have focused rather on the technical issues that are the most urgent part, let's say. But it's good that you raise this, because we think my feeling is that we can use precisely those institutions or organizations that are let's say like-minded, no, to work together and do outreach activities that are really meaningful and that reach those we want to reach, no? Because different audiences, different publics have also different ways of understanding things. So there would be a good reason to organize, not just to have the report published in the website of the United Nations. That certainly is not sufficient, even if it is translated into all languages. No, if we can come, no, and work with you to disseminate and to spread the word and to give a more in-depth inside message, that would be excellent. So thank you for your question. I take it as a suggestion. Thank you.
Sure. お願いします。
I just wanted to say that I'm how impressed I am that how many people are here, and we're keeping you late for dinner, I think. And I would also like to say that, I mean, we pretend to be experts, but in fact, nobody listens to the experts unless the public is interested. And so we had that experience in the United States in the early 1980s. There was a fear that we had a president that could get us into a nuclear war. The public being mobilized. I was part of a march of 1 million people through New York City. And then the president and the Congress paid attention. The president changed his policy. and didn't talk about starting a war with the Soviet Union anymore. And the Congress decided to get educated on these issues. Part of the Congress is always educated from a certain perspective because they represent places where there are factories which make nuclear weapons, or laboratories, or have bases. So they are continually educated on the importance of nuclear weapons and to our security. But until the broader public gets interested, the people who don't represent what we call the military-industrial complex, they don't get educated, and therefore they feel that they cannot debate these issues. So you're the important people here. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。では最後に湯崎知事お願いします。
はい、いくつかご質問ありましたけども、核抑止っていうのがこれまで機能してたかっていうかというご質問もあったと思うんですけども、この抑止の議論をするときに、もちろん0-1じゃないということですね。残念ながらですね、どんな兵器とか、例えば包丁だって場所とか時の場合によってはですね、抑止力になるわけですよね。だから核兵器っていうのも当然抑止の効果はあります。ただすごく問題は、それは今核抑止論者が言うように、それは常にその抑止効果が 100% 働くのかということですよね。そうではない。まずいくつか問題がありますけども、今のイスラエルとガザの関係を見てもですね、イスラエルは核兵器持ってるわけですよ。でイランとイスラエル、あるいはそのパレスチナとイスラエルの関係を見てもですね、イスラエルが核兵器を持っているからといってイスラエルに対する攻撃は止まらないわけなんですよね。であるいはその核兵器を持っている国が核兵器を持ってない国に対して攻撃をする、今まさにウクライナ戦争がそうですけども、この場合はある意味で言うと一方的にやられてしまう、戦争がかえって長引いてしまうというようなことがあるわけなんですよね。なのでこの核抑止への依存というのが非常に問題であるし、で最大の問題は抑止をするという、これは事前のことなんですけれども、結果ということも考えなければいけなくて、その結果っていうのは何かっていうと、その期待損失、戦争が起きた場合の期待損失ですね。期待損失っていうのは何によって構成されているかっていうと、その戦争が起きる確率と、それから起きた場合の損失の大きさですよね。でこの確率がですね、仮に小さくなったとしてもゼロではない。でこの核抑止が破れた場合の、核戦争になった場合の損失っていうのは、これはもう莫大なわけですよ。だからどんなに小さな確率でもこの損失の大きさがあまりにも大きいので、これはもう許容できないことではないかということだと思うんですよね。でその損失の大きさが何かというところが、まさに今科学的なエビデンスを持って考えてみようというのが今の国連のこの作業になっていると思うんですけども、これは結果としてはですね、本当にどうなるか分かりませんけれども、もう非常に大きな損失になるということはもう明らかだと思います。先ほどどうやって知らせるかというのはありましたけれども、非常にしっかりとしたエビデンスの結果が出たら、私それノーベル平和賞ものじゃないかと思うんですけどノーベル平和賞をもらったらですね、かなり多くの人に刺さるんじゃないかと思いますけども、そういう問題があるということですね。でそういう意味で核兵器の方が安いんじゃないかっていう議論もまたあったんですけども、これもですね、その事前の抑止の部分だけで見ると安いっていう場面もあるかもしれません。ただそれが結局敗れた場合の結果っていうのを考えた時にものすごく高くつくっていうことですよね。それをやはり考えないといけない。今の核抑止論者っていうのは抑止が敗れた時の結果ということを全く考慮してないということがものすごく問題で、本当はそこが一番 我々がみんなが考えなきゃいけないというか、その安全保障を考えている人が考えなきゃいけないことなんですけども、それが考えられてないというのが本当に大きな問題だと思います。
はい、ありがとうございます。先ほどフォン・ヒッペル博士の方から皆さん夕ご飯の時間も過ぎてっていうふうにありました。本当に司会の不手際もありまして、時間がかなり伸びてしまいましたが、皆さんから本当にたくさんのですねご質問と熱心な議論ができたんじゃないかなと思います。オンラインの方からはですね Q&A にはご質問が入っていない状況ですので、ここで質疑の方はというか全体を終わりにしていきたいと思います。最後別にまとめることはないとは思うんですが、改めてですね本当に核抑止からの脱却を目指してというところに我々非常に具体的な今前進をしていると、ステップを前に進めているというところであると思います。そしてそれは決して政府や国連機関だけがやること考えることではないし、もちろん科学者だけがやることではない、自治体だけではない、本当により広い市民社会とともにですねみんなで考えみんなで進んでいくという、本当にそういった時代に私たち今足を踏み入れているということを改めて実感いたしました。以上まとめというほどのものもありませんが、皆さんとですねここの話をこれからもっともっと続けて、議論をしていきたいと思います。では今日素晴らしいご発言いただきましたパネリストの皆様にどうぞ温かい拍手をお願いいたします。はい、そして高校生の皆さん、高校生の方も大学生の方も含めて遅い時間まで本当にご参加ありがとうございました。では MC の方にマイクをお戻しします。
ありがとうございました。改めてご紹介いたします。湯崎様、アナマリア・セトクラミス様、フランク・フォン・ヘッペル様、中村様、本日は本当にありがとうございました。今一度大きな拍手をお送りください。それではこれをもちまして本日のプログラムはすべて終了とさせていただきます。皆様最後までお付き合いいただきまして本当にありがとうございました。お忘れ物などないようにお気をつけてお進みください。ありがとうございました。